Okay. Hello. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, or good evening to the ones that are connecting online. My name is Sergio Liete. I'm the team leader for transport sector in the European Commission, and I will be moderating this session. So this session is called Paratransit Capacity Building Programs, Leveraging Paratransit Professionalization to Decarbonize the Transport Sector in Developing Countries. And it is an initiative of the Africa Transport Policy Program, the SSATP. As you know, the SSATP is a long program that started more than 30 years ago. And in the current program, what we call DP4, we are several donors, the World Bank, the European Union, the Swiss Development Agency, French Development Agency, African Development Bank. So we thought, as a part of this, the current DP, we have one of the thematic areas that is urban mobility. And we thought that it was interesting to discuss about a topic that is the professionalization of the paratransit bus services. That is important because, as we have seen in our in the different sessions that we have to which we have attended these days, we have talked a lot about technologies. We have for the decarbonization. We have talked a lot about the passengers, but there is something that we cannot forget, that this is the people that makes possible that transport is working. So the drivers and the owners of the buses. And we will, as we will see in this session, there is this is a complex issue, where our topics like fleet, fleet renewal, and the operational improvements that is closely linked to the capacities of the people that are running these services. And we think that we thought that it was very important to bring this subject today to the matter. But as you will see, this is, as I has just said, is a complex matter, and today you will just have an appetizer, because we will not have much time of discussing in depth. So you are all invited to an event that will take place tomorrow. It's a side event of the Transforming Transportation Days. It's called the Paratransit Day, and it will take place in this building in the 7th floor. And at the end of the session, you will see the link. If you are interested and you want to know more about paratransit, you can come tomorrow. So I'm going to start. So this session will be structured with a very quick welcome address by Ibu Diouf, and then we will have 4 presenters, 3 in person and 1 online. And I will introduce them as before they present their different interventions. And at the end of the session, we will have a debate with questions and answers. So Ibu is the practice manager for transport in West and Central Africa. And he was previously the program manager for the SSATP. So and previously, even before working for the World Bank, he was an expert at the Dakar Urban Transport Authority, well, the technical director, in fact, and director of operations of the Senegal Bus Company. So he's very knowledgeable of this topic, and and he will give us some welcoming address. Thank you, Ibu.
Thank you, Sergio, and good morning, everyone. I'm not sure really that we would really need a welcome address now after all you have said, introducing both SSATP, the panelists, and myself. As I indicated earlier, because we are a bit late, I'm going to shift the protocol and just make it very, very short to listen to our brilliant panelists. So I would like to welcome you on behalf of SSATP, the Africa Transport Policy Program, and the World Bank Group in this very important session. We have been hearing a lot on decarbonization yesterday. I think for those who have been following the debate between UITP Secretary General and the General Motors representative yesterday, he was advocating for decongesting first before decarbonizing. And this fits very well into the thematic discussion that we will be having now related to paratransport systems. We all know that the paratransit sector is one of the main providers of urban mobility services or transport services in many cities in the African, I would say in the developing world. But it comes with some challenges. First one is related to efficiency. The second one is related to safety, and the last but not least has to do with sustainability, and sustainability/profitability, because it's also linked to the resources. We have a panel of brilliant experts that would actually lead us through the topic, and I would just wanted to take the opportunity to thank WRI and SSATP teams who have been working tirelessly in these last weeks to make this session possible. I would also like to thank Sergio, our moderator, who traveled from Brussels really to be in person here to chair this, important discussion. This is just a starting, I would say, platform that we would have to continue not only tomorrow but beyond, because it's a long way. If there is only one thing that keeps the mayors and Minister of Transport awake at night, it has to do with reforming and professionalizing the paratransport sector in the order for them to be a great contributor to fueling the urban economies in our cities, but also offering a more decent, sustainable, and efficient transport system to our citizens. Thank you very much, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ibu. So our first speaker today is Dr. Jacqueline Klopp. Jackie, she's the director of the Center for Sustainable Urban Development at Columbia's University Climate School, and her research focuses mainly on African cities and on new technologies for mapping to strengthen advocacy for improved public transportation. Jackie is a founding member of the Digital Matatus Consortium and new collaborative platforms on open transit data for African and Latin American cities. They call Digital Transport for Africa and Atom. Please, Jackie.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I probably don't need to remind everyone that we are in a climate crisis. Every day we're hearing about new disasters like what's going on in California. The transport sector is a sector that is not doing very well in terms of controlling its emissions. If you look at the emissions graph, it goes up and up and up. So we really need to get our act together. Now, there is an issue of equity. The transportation emissions are very high in the global north, the OECD countries. If you take a look at the graph here, you can see that a lot of the emissions are often caused by the individual cars. If you look at the emissions in places like Africa, Latin America, you see much higher mixes of buses and public transport and much lower emissions generally. So we have a global equity problem. Most of the emissions have been caused by the global north. Consequences, including for transport systems, will be felt also in the global south. So increasingly we're seeing what you see in this picture here in Nairobi, floods, extreme heat, and the transport systems in the global south are having to address those problems. So there's a global justice problem that we are facing. But even though the emissions have been largely produced by the global north, there are profound reasons to continue to push decarbonization in the global south. because it is an opportunity also to radically improve what I call the popular transport systems that are the dominant mode, so that most people take and have been grossly neglected in terms of investment and improvements. So if you take a look at this data, for example, of the modal share for motorized trips, you can see in places like Africa, the bulk of the trips are done by minibuses. You can also see in Asia the importance of the 2- and 3-wheelers. These are a lot of trips and a lot of polluting trips. And so if we actually want to decarbonize, we have to look at paratransit, or also what I call popular transport, as a target for decarbonization. Andrew mentioned it's important to have a really good narrative. Well, the reason also to decarbonize is that the co-benefits are profound. The emissions from transport are a major public health problem in terms of respiratory, cardiovascular diseases, and so forth. It's in fact one of the biggest public health problems we're facing. And transport is an enormous source in cities across the globe, but particularly in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Actually, in almost all our cities. Crashes, we know, is the #1 killer. A lot of people are in unsafe transport in this sector. And by improving this sector to reduce emissions, we will also be addressing these profound public health issues. And again, there's an equity issue here, that the majority of people who are taking popular transport, many of them are poor segments of the population. They are overly exposed compared to other parts of the population to these deep problems. And then in terms of public health and the crashes and the air pollution and so forth. And then of course there's an income and livelihood issue as well, that users of popular transport, if they can get improvements in those services, can improve their livelihoods. And then finally, if we can improve these systems really profoundly, there will be less need for people to feel like they need to escape to owning a car or finding other means. And that's a lot of income saved as well that can be used for other things. Fortunately, there are many different ways to do this decarbonization of popular transport. We're going to hear about that soon. We can improve fuels. UNEP is doing a lot of important work around this. The electrification that we've already talked about, which requires infrastructure, retraining. We need to go beyond used vehicle bans to vehicle upgrades, so recapitalization programs, creating incentives for better vehicles. We can improve operations, we can create better networks, we can reduce the idling, we can get better integration to mass transit, which will improve the ridership and the return on the investment in mass transit. And yeah, we can just encourage, modal shift even among middle classes if we can get those services to a high enough quality. So I think there's many, many different ways we can do this. I just want to quickly say it requires a lot of movement of finance and a change in thinking from just big projects to a more systems approach where we're looking at all these different modes in these different cities and how to improve them, including our popular transport. It requires data, monitoring for impacts, and that's also important to access carbon financing to do this. And part of that is actually leveraging things like low-cost air quality sensors to be able to make the measurements around impacts. We need to be monitoring air quality in our cities anyway. And finally, we really need this capacity building that we're going to talk about today. It's going to require professionalization, but it's also going to require a lot of collaboration. And we really need to scale up the growing efforts in this area that I know that my colleagues are going to talk about next. So thank you very much.
So, thank you, Jackie, for having said the big picture around decarbonization and paratransit professionalization, as well to mention the co-benefits and the equity angle. Before we pass to our next presenter, let me just say a note on terminology, because I forgot to say it at the beginning, because paratransit is perhaps for the practitioners is a word that we know well and we know where we're referring to, but perhaps not for everybody. So paratransit refers to the what you was used to call informal transport, or in French call also artisanal transport, just to make sure that everybody in the room understand what we are talking about, because I forgot to say it at the beginning. So now that Jackie has said the big picture, Iman, I think Iman is Urban Mobility Project Manager at World Resource Institute, and she will explain us how to connect the professionalization of paratransit agenda with the climate action one. So please, Iman, if you can.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So today I'll be talking to you about connecting informal transport to climate action. And this is really based on a new paper that we've done with VREF and WRI. That's really looking at how transport, it gained attention at COP27, but it really failed to acknowledge the paratransit or the informal sector in NDC plans in the negotiations that happened. Angola was the only country that actually mentioned GHG emissions from the paratransit or the informal sector. There were no countries that made specific recommendations, at least from the Latin America or the African countries, for mitigating emissions in the sector. Now, we do need to be mindful, because I live and I've grown up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I know how these NDCs are developed. It's in a closed room with very specific people. It doesn't look at integrated sort of recommendations from the transport sector and agriculture sector. Some of the key data points are missing. So there are local policies and recommendations that do take into consideration the paratransit or the informal sector, but sometimes this does not get translated into the NDCs and therefore are missing from the global conversation. So really the scope of this paper is to give a basic framing to connect climate and informal transport. It's to recommend main areas for action, but really the most important thing is to inform dialogue, because we do not have the answers or all the answers, but I think collaboratively we will be able to find the right ones. So just a summary is that the three main recommendations, as also mentioned by Jackie, is that we need to look at establishing a baseline for interventions to decarbonize, so really important to collect that data. The second part is really looking at improving informal services. And the big question there would be how. So Jackie gave us an outline of the types of improvements or interventions that a lot of cities are looking into. But we do need to unpack why they're not happening or why they're not getting implemented. And finally, the electrification agenda, which we've heard so much about, but we do want to make an emphasis on the need for connection with energy supplies and making sure that decarbonization electrification is not synonymous with decarbonization. If the grids are not clean, then you're not really solving the problem. So really thinking about our energy sources as well. So this is Jackie went through this, so I'll just quickly mention there's the positive side and the not so positive side about the informal transport systems. They're demand responsive, they're filling a need, but there's also challenges on safety, on maintenance, on inconsistent pricing, on unpredictable routes that could really, as mentioned earlier, really affect the inefficiencies of the transport systems in our cities. So this is a city that I come from, right? This is an open market area in the center of Addis Ababa. You'll see the LRT, which cost $475 million there, and there's only one cart. And then right next to it, you'll see the major road that has the people, the freight, the minibuses, the buses, and it's just, you can see how inefficient it is. So how is a $475 million infrastructure not solving some of the major transport issues that we're having in our cities? And this goes to what Jackie was saying about the lack of integration, the need for integration, and really thinking about where our investment is going and if that's really solving the problem. So I'll give you a snapshot, just a quick snapshot of Africa's paratransit or informal transport story. So we've heard about that majority of trips are made by the informal sector, but also that it's filling a gap. But that gap came from the lack of investment in public infrastructure. So it was almost like a temporary solution that then became very permanent over many, many years, and now it's really difficult to change these systems. But there is an opportunity. Majority of Africa's infrastructure is yet to be built. So there is a chance for us to make that change. And it's a lot of livelihoods depend on this sector. So we do need to really keep that in mind. And there's lack of coordination amongst many of the partners that work on paratransit. And we are duplicating efforts and really it's not resulting in change because of this lack of coordination. So the key message, one of our key messages from the paper is really to think about emissions, but also to think about air quality. Many of the local governments and authorities that we work with are more concerned about air quality than they are about emissions. So, but we understand why the emission part is a big part, and we do have a lot of convincing that we need to do, but air quality, they feel it, they see it when they go out in their cities. So that is a bigger concern, especially with the health impacts. So again, not just to say that we need data, we need quality data, not piecemeal data where we're collecting data in one neighborhood and looking at the air quality, but thinking about it from a systems perspective and looking at that. Right now, a lot of cities are looking at importation of vehicles and looking at that as a data point, which is great, I think, for now, but really thinking about the existing fleet and how they're contributing to the air quality and the emissions challenge. Not to put up a picture of myself, but just because I want to share a personal story. So when we talk about improving quality of informal services, I think this is the first time I took a boda boda in Kampala. I come from a city where motorcycles are banned in the city, but that improving the safety and having applications and the safety part really improved and got me to actually use it. Now, it's not the safest option, and this goes back to the discussion we had yesterday, which is, would I rather be stuck in congestion in a safer vehicle, or would I rather get to my meeting on time and risk a little bit of my safety and get on a boda boda? And obviously, we have to choose boda boda in order to reduce the time travel. But really thinking that there are many ways to improve the paratransit and looking at the impact or the energy consumption of the different modes is a critical part of this. And the NDCs can package all of this. And then the third is the electrification of minibuses and 2- and 3-wheelers. The big message here for us is that electrification is part of the solution. We're seeing a lot of financing going to electrification and losing out on the basic infrastructure, basic changes that we need. And a lot of African cities are getting on the hype of electrification and almost neglecting the basic needs that will make electrification successful in these cities. And really to emphasize on clean grids and energy access as a big part of it. But that's easier said than done. So I think these are the key things that we need to consider, and we hope that this dialogue will inform so that we actually have very localized, very feasible solutions. So one is we do need expert facilitators. We need to talk to the informal operators. They should be here. They should be part of that conversation, or else we're not going to bring about that change. And this is going to be very painful, very slow in some cases, and it will require a lot of data. The second is that we need financing that can weather the storm. Very resilient financing from donors and partners that understand that this is a painful and incremental process. If a project fails and the financing stops, we're going to have to go 10 steps back just to restart the conversation, especially with the paratransit operators. Now that they know that the projects are not going to happen, they also don't want to integrate. Give me 1 minute and I'll wrap up. The third is to avoid shying away from the political economies or power dynamics and historical roots of how these systems came to be. So if we do not talk about this, we are not going to get anywhere. It's really important. Just to give you an example, second-hand vehicles get exported to Africa, right? So the global north countries, they get really nice, really safe electric cars, but we end up driving the ones that are not so great in the African cities, and no one is held accountable. It's like the accountability is put on the countries to put stricter policies in place, but the power dynamic and the trade power dynamic doesn't allow for that to happen. We need tailored and bottom-up interventions, as mentioned earlier. And just the last point is that in order to have better collaboration and coordination, we need to come organized to government. There is a fatigue of talking to the number of partners that work in this area. But if we're able to coordinate and collect data together, that is comparable because it's in the same format. Just as simple as that. And we share that data with government so that they don't have to keep collecting it from different people. Then that's a critical part. But just to end, who are we doing this for? And I think we don't need to forget that it is a very critical need, and we are trying to improve this for the mother with a child on her back with the groceries, trying to do her everyday life. We are trying to improve it for the elderly that are navigating unsafe streets, to get around in their city. For the children that are trying to get to school in really dangerous conditions, and the ones that actually use the paratransit but have to travel in really unsafe conditions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iman. So we have heard a lot about the need to talk, to put the stakeholders together. And at the CCTP, we, as I said at the beginning, we really think that we have to put the people that run these systems, that have to provide services to the populations that need the transport, at the center of our approach. And that's why we are very happy to have online Amanda and Gavirano. Amanda is the chairperson of the National Physical Planning Board of Uganda. And she's done also research on informality and transport complexities, on road safety, the quality of public space in Kampala, in partnership with several international researchers. So Amanda initiated the non-motorized transport pilot plan, a typical example of inclusiveness, whereby walking, cycling, and the quality of public space have been prioritized. And Amanda is the independent chairperson of the Greater Kampala Paratransit Consultative Forum. That is about building trust, and she's going to explain us, please, how this consultative process works. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be able to join, although not physically. The informal aspect that Iman and Jacqueline have talked about is where we had to start from. How informal are the paratransit providers? This is what, on the government side, might be the thought, but actually they have structures. And this is where we started from, identifying who they were, the structures they were working within, and how best they could improve their capacity to be part of the public transport improvement plans. There was lack of trust because there was a power gap between them and regulatory authorities, that's government. And government is looking at improving public transport, providing BRT options. The paratransit are a bit scared. How are they going to survive? Because like Jacqueline mentioned, it's about livelihoods. It's also about sustainability of change. So we started by letting them know that One, they have unhealthy competition amongst themselves because they are so disjointed, so many associations, and under the consultative forum, which I also chair, we're able to bring them together, and there's an umbrella association right now, which government can now work through and be able to communicate. There was really lack of trust. One, because several plans were coming up and there was lack of implementation. So they felt like, yeah, we still are the winners. We still are the best providers. And indeed, they still have the solidity to firmly provide the public transport service within the Greater Kampala area. There was lack of capacity amongst themselves, and we have tried to bridge this gap. For instance, them to a trip through AFD support, a trip to Cape Town, and we were able to see that they could coordinate, collaborate, and work together with government entities because they went with them. And then they could be at the same level, so they are partners, not enemies, for change. And it's really a good starting point because they've been the experts in this field. They've been running the city. They've been moving the city. And they are informal to us as users, as regulatory authorities, but they are formal amongst themselves. So government entities had put a gap because they are a bit afraid. How are they going to introduce one bus that is going to displace about 70 people into the taxis? Because each taxi takes about 14 passengers. So if there are 10 taxis, those are 140 passengers. Those are 2 buses. And each taxi employs about 4 people. Those are 4 families. So one bus is able to replace so many families, and the livelihoods will be affected. So we thought that government should look at this kind of perspective if we are going to actually transform. And we also know through this forum that government will not be able to drop buses onto Kampala streets and that the system runs efficiently just like that. The process of change has to be more gradual, more logical, more inclusive, especially factoring in the current providers. And that change is the change that we desire, that we should it should be sustainable. In this forum as well, we were able to say that better slow than fast as long as you're in the right direction with the right team. So we mapped out the stakeholders, starting with the taxi operators, but also the metropolitan affairs, because the proposed public transport improvements actually go through the city boundaries and cross areas of jurisdiction of governance. So that also was a thing that we had to look at. So far, we see that there's a bit of change, that there's openness. There was lack of transparency, lack of trust, lack of information sharing space. So the neutral platform that was provided to enhance collaboration and dialogue has really been a great success in Kampala. And the taxi guys are also not as intimidated as they used to be regarding public transport improvements like BRT plans, railway plans. They are more confident now because they feel that they are more in conversations with government. That's one. 2, we have built capacity that they should not have an unhealthy competition. They should work on improvements to ensure that they stay in the market, on the market, for any changes that are coming along. And maybe it could be that they it's a source of employment for them. But for the city of Kampala, if the taxis go on strike, there will be no smooth movement to jobs, to school, markets, to etc. So we know that they are valuable, but we also know the inefficiencies. They also know. For instance, they've been asking about support on fleet recapitalization. They've been asking for capacity building to understand how they can improve their systems, especially the routing. And we did some simple exercises for them. We asked them, so how much money do you make for a distance of 70 kilometers? They said, no, we almost make no money. What about a distance of 10 kilometers? We make more money because we make more trips. So we prepared them somehow that you can make better business if you are a feeder system. And they know that. We brought along also the border taxis. Iman, thank you for that lovely picture of Kampala that you shared. And I think these two are running the city. So we brought them on board in these discussions because there's now a competition between them and the public transport providers, the taxis, the current dominant supplier. The borders ideally should also make more money, more profit if they fly shorter routes. Shorter trips rather. So we did a survey with them and they mentioned that they do only 500 meters is the best route they can do. So that's the last and the first mile connectivity where they can play a role. And we can have all the other changes included in this kind of thing. So they are competing now for shorter trips with the taxis. So when the buses just arrive, when we are not ready regarding the operationalization, the routing, the infrastructure changes, I think it's going to be a big mistake. Better that we get set and have a vision, which we have really set out right now. We have good conversations with the Ministry of Works and Transport, good conversations with the Greater Kampala Metropolitan Authorities, plus the taxi drivers. One important thing before I conclude is that a neutral platform, a feeling of importance as a partner, a feeling of trust is very important in these discussions, because it's not only about emissions, it's not about decarbonization, it's not about decongestion, it's about livelihoods, it's about real change that can affect several families. So this trust building is something that we think every city that is running like Kampala on paratransit has to adopt this kind of approach to ensure that we have all stakeholders and partners' wishes, opinions captured. Then we move together. Even if we move slowly, it will give us long-lasting results. And I think the expertise is very important, because if government alone engages with the paratransit sector, the relationship or the power hierarchy is a bit skewed. They will not trust government more than they would trust an expert who is neutral. And this is what we brought on board in this process, that we got a neutral expert in the paratransit sector to engage government and also paratransit. So there was really, it has taken almost 3 years. It's a process, but it's a very beautiful, painful, worthwhile process. Thank you very much, and I wish I could be there with you all.
Thank you, Amanda, for raising this very important topic of building trust among all the stakeholders. And now we are going to go a step forward, because we are going to have a presentation of an ongoing paratransit formalization pilot program in Pretoria, South Africa, that will be done by Nanga Mamponya. Nanga. Nanga is an investment banking and project finance professional at DBSA, responsible for infrastructure. And in addition, she's passionate about women emancipation and economic inclusion. Through her years of infrastructure, and in particular in transport sector, she pioneered a podcast on investing in woman-centric transport in 2020. Thank you, Nanga, please.
Thank you, Sergio. I thought I was going to greet you just after midday and say good afternoon, but still morning. Good morning. I'm here to present the true transformation and inclusive story of transportation. The program called Transforming Transit in South Africa. I know it has a similar name to the conference, but it's not related. So, I have this thing over here. So this is the story of the public transportation in South Africa. We've heard many speakers, even from yesterday, talking about the plight and the quality of minibus taxi industries, which we call paratransit. And really, this is proof that we all agree it's not up to scratch, it's not well developed, it's not supported. In South Africa, it operated illegally for some time. Even when it was legalized, it still was treated like a stepchild. It wasn't given the adequate attention and the support it required. Even with the introduction of new systems, it was still overtaken. We have BRTs that got bigger support, structured kind of implementation and operations, whereas the minibus taxi industry didn't get the same support. And the surprising thing about this is, like everyone else has said, it is the biggest mover of people. in our cities. And these are people who are largely marginalized, low income, and live in poor communities. So what we're bringing today is we recognize that this cannot be okay. We have a system that moves over 69% of the households in South Africa, a system that contributes to congestion. It has over 250,000 minibus vehicles that are moving in our cities. It moves more people. It makes more trips than buses, BRTs, and trains, but it receives the least support. So what are the issues? What are the core issues? They have been ventilated quite well by other speakers, and it's the same for South Africa. The core issues really remain poor service quality for passengers, poor working conditions for drivers and all of those people who work in the industry. The authorities have a difficulty and limitation in controlling what is happening there in terms of regulation, administration, and really getting to know what exactly is happening in that space. And the impact is quite huge to the society, in that there are constant threats to violence. Those who are familiar with the minibus taxi industry in South Africa, the taxi violence are rife. People get killed, passengers, operators. It becomes a mess when we're faced with taxi violence, not to mention that everything else comes to a standstill. And the cost of mobility is a main issue because of lack of support from the industry, from different parts of the economy, as well as from government. Road safety, not to mention road safety, poor training will lead to road safety. Unhealthy competition, which was mentioned earlier, also leads to this poor road safety. And being the biggest part of this conversation, the environmental effect, all of this has. So what we're trying to do now, in supporting the industry deal with these issues and eliminate the efficiencies that everybody's talking about, we have seen and taken upon ourselves this opportunity to introduce reforms and effect change through this program called Transforming Transit. This is where now the real story of change begins. And the rationale really is centered around mainly the inefficiencies that come from mainly the oversupply and unsuitable size of vehicles, coupled with high levels of dead mileage, which directly impact on carbon emissions. So the study that we started doing already demonstrate that by reducing the fleet on that particular pilot route, you're already benefiting from over 21% reductions in carbon emissions. So this they clearly demonstrate that without even doing anything else, just by reducing the size of the fleet, you're already contributing to the environment. So this is the thesis of the project. We're looking at hopefully achieving business improvement, industry empowerment, innovation and entrepreneurship, job creation, and community upliftment. This is where you're going to see drivers getting better working conditions, users getting better and a safer service, and then owners with the potential to earn better returns. But we may also be aware that this can never happen with us sitting in this room, having these fancy conversations. Someone mentioned that we need to have the industry part of the discussion in order for us to deal with these issues more conclusively. So the argument for us is we need to get greater cooperation amongst the operators themselves, the industry participants themselves, to make it possible for us to deliver these efficiencies, matching the supply to the demand that's there. So our approach is really on three folds. First, we went on the ground. We're trying to analyze the existing business, collecting data and detailed information on the current business fundamentals. Also, modeling these operations and building improved business processes. The second part talks about the development of the new business plans. And this will include financial modeling of those proposed business plans. Now moving us to the next step, which is where we are heading now with the project, which is the testing of those improvements. So while we're doing this while we're supporting the associations to pilot these new operations and business models, and then make the required adjustments while identifying potential investment opportunities to support in further phases. So tomorrow we have a Paratransit Day, and we'll be presenting a lot more detail on this project. So the issues around what an association looks like and versus what we're going to end up with within a corporatized form of a business, those will be presented in a lot more detail in the discussions tomorrow. So this is what the operations improvements pilot aims to achieve. It's focusing on a specific corridor in that association network. This is a 50-kilometer route with about 29 vehicles, which are being reduced now to 21. So the rollout improvements will be in stages, focusing on scheduling the services, which is something completely foreign in the minibus taxi industry. Centralizing the fleet, the drivers, as well as operations management. We're centralizing revenue management, introducing cashless payment systems. The benefit to introducing cashless payment systems is not only to the taxi operator, but to the businesses that are operating around the taxi ranks and providing different services to the commuters and to the drivers. We also aim to introduce training and capacity building. This aims really to demonstrate the commercial viability of this new entity, which is now going to be a transport operating entity. And this proof of concept then will iron out operational issues before the wider implementation, and then as well as identify a need for additional technical and/or financial support. Yes, we expect to see improved service. We expect to see increased empowerment. We expect to see security for the drivers, for the operators, and all parties involved, as well as growth and innovation. When we talk about empowerment, it's an interesting case for us because it brings up the inclusivity issue in the discussion, because the minibus taxi industry has been a passenger, excuse the pun. It's been a passenger in its own industry. They don't participate in any other part of the value chain. They don't earn revenue elsewhere within the value chain. They're simply providing a service, and they pay to other service providers for everything. They become a cost line in the entire system. So what we're trying to do now, which was next step, we're launching the pilot, which will be this corporatized association into a transport operating company in using the pilot parameters that I presented earlier. This pilot will be launched in May, in the next 2 months. Then in parallel, we'll be running the stakeholder roadshows, where we explore different avenues and speaking to other stakeholders, including government, financiers, banks, as well as, most importantly, other associations who might be keen on watching the success of this pilot, just to also gauge on what their interest would be, what the expectations would be, and what would make them interested in participating. We then get into the knowledge exchange program. Then at the end of it, we'll review the results, see where the areas of improvements are, and then start our rollout. So in short, ride with us towards this inclusive mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanga. So we have had over 4 presentations. As you have seen, we have gone from the overall picture to the more operational aspects of the paratransit professionalization and capacity building. Now, according to my timer, we have 12 minutes for questions and answers. If you want to ask from the public in person or from the online participants. If not, yes, please. I think you have to stand up and...
Thank you very much. for the opportunity. My name is Keshav Sharma. I represent Nepal. I am Secretary for Physical Infrastructure and Transport, Government of Nepal. I have a query or my sharing of my experience that it was said in the beginning of this session that the globe, southern globe is more affected by the climate change, but we are not in the southern globe. But still, in the eastern globe as well, some countries, they are suffering from the climate change, although they don't have any contributions, these considerable considerations in the climate change process. I represent that country, that is Nepal. When we talk about the transforming of transportation, or in this case, we have to think seriously its complexity. I totally agree with Iman Abukar in her presentation. It is very easy to say, but equally difficult to do. For the least development countries like Nepal, what to transfer? Transforming transportation means first there should be adequate transport facilities. We are facing the lack of basic transport facility and what to transform. That basic transport facilities should be in place so that we can talk about the transformation. So there should be a very doable, practical blend on the providing basic connectivity facility and then transforming the facility which is in place. For that, we have to change our mindset. The people, they are thinking from the political or decision-making level to the general people, they are thinking about their prosperity when they have their own car. Don't want to use the public transportation. This is the first issue. The second one is they don't have the space to make adequate infrastructure facility for the public transport. As the cities are unplanned and space, there is no space. By this reason, the multilateral banks and the donor communities
Excuse me, can you please summarize your question?
Yeah,
tomorrow we have the full day from Paratransit, so we can debate, but
okay,
if you can...
I am coming on that point. So that the donor communities, multilateral banks are not much interested to transform. They are interested for expanding or developing new roads, but it is a very challenging issue, so that my request is we talk on it very seriously and come into a doable solution. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was more a comment than a question. So I think we move to the next one.
Hi, good morning or afternoon. Great panel. Thank you for sharing your studies and views on informal popular transportation. And I'm so happy Fernando is here with me, because we both share one thing, that is, I care about informal transportation because my grandfather was the driver of a colectivo in Bogota when it was informal. So I work in the informal sector. I was collecting the fare from my grandfather. And I care about this in many ways, but and we want to have these systems improve, electric, no emissions, providing jobs to local communities and prosperous, and because they're part of the picture, so we get that. One of the challenges that we have is that these systems have been in place in the informality under the table. Once we bring them above the table, some of those business models do not work. And we have tried to work with these companies in Medellin, and their balance sheets are not open, transparent. So I wonder if you guys have done some research, and I know the last speaker spoke about really helping in their business model development. What will be the impact if we really know what the cost of running those systems? Still with the small companies, small owners, one vehicle, one person, but really above the table, or really paying all the cost. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that question. It's a very interesting question. Hi, am I on now? Okay, thank you. Thanks for that question. So it's an interesting point you're raising, because in order for us to take it under the table and put it over the table, we need to change certain fundamentals. And what we're trying to do with this project, with this pilot project that we're undertaking, is to go exactly to that point of the process. Look at the basic fundamentals of the current business model and see what needs to change in order for you to change the operating model. So one of the things that we're starting with is corporatizing. So how do you do the corporatizing process? The corporatizing process, if the operating licensing regime at the moment is attached to a vehicle and an owner, and an individual owner. So if you were to corporatize that structure from an association that is a member-based organization, it's not an entity, with members that are owning the businesses and operating licenses, that corporatization process involves transferring the operating license from a member who is a business owner into the entity, which is now the transport operating entity. That's the first step. So you're removing ownership of the vehicle and the operating license into a company. So how then do you, from that point, this is when you start looking at, once you collectivize those operations and the ownership, that's when you can start now looking at the business model. We start scheduling now, we start fueling in bulk, we start introducing cashless system, because now you've combined the operations. So there are certain steps that you have to take before you change the operating model. So I hope I've answered that question without getting into more detail.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, is this working? Okay, great. Sorry. I do want to point out, though, that almost every functioning public transit system requires some kind of investment and subsidy because of all the public good that it creates. Unless somehow those entities own land and can make money off of that, they need some sort of support. And we have really not put that kind of money on the table for upgrading and improving these systems. I know Durban has tried by creating an incentive system where they're actually giving operators more money if they perform better services. So there's like service contracts, right? Where you can, because what's happening now is that you have a lot of the drivers, the people who are working in the system, severely exploited. They work long hours, low wages, and that's part of the business model. And that's pretty unacceptable. So if we want to get away from that, we have to figure out how to get money into these systems, just like we do in other cities, in a way that's actually going to improve the conditions and the services. We can maybe do some of that through capacity and support for improving systems and making, better profit, but we also need to think about that subsidy or investment because of the public good. And that's something we're going to have to talk about, in my view.
Interesting one, Jackie. Thank you for that. It's slightly different in the way we have looked at it. We thought, let's take the existing business model with the same revenue and try and see how much we can improve sustainability by just increasing efficiencies. Create a system, create an entity or operating companies that can then attract that further support. So before then, we can look at subsidies, operating subsidies, and so on and so forth. But at this stage, the industry is not subsidized. So if you don't go around with the same picture and say, we're looking for subsidies, we're looking to help the industry get subsidies, the issues are going to be the same. You're not operating, you don't have a scheduled service, you are not operating as a collective, you don't look like a company, you don't have this, you don't have that. So the first step for us was to ensure that this existing business in its current form can stand on its own with the same amount of revenue. And then you say, what additional support is required? What infrastructure upgrades are required? Then you can tap into what funding is available. So the only financial assistance that has been made available for this program is for technical support to help them now create that revised business model.
Thank you. We have one last question. Only one, please.
Yes, I'm Fernanda Rivera. I'm the Director of Public Transport in Mexico City's government. We have the same trouble with microbuses or minibuses. I have one question. How are you dealing with the high interest rates that the banks are giving to these new companies that are forming because they don't have these bank good receipts or everything? And the second question is, in the case of 2- and 3-wheelers, what are the best practices? Because for minibuses and vans, you can make these transport companies. But I think that for rickshaws and 2- and 3-wheelers, it's really hard to make a transport company. So what are the best practices that you know about? Thank you very much.
All right, I'll try that one using the example of our project.
But Amanda is also online if she wants to also to react to that.
All right, so it is one of the key issues which, through this project, we're also trying to address. Because once you look at pricing is a factor of the risk profile. So once you look at an individual's risk profile, they can run away with a taxi, they can hire a driver that is not licensed, they can just get away with not having insurance in their vehicle, or park them wherever they want to park it. But if you have those managed by a company, owned by a company, if you're lending to a company for vehicles that are staged in a particular place, there's a depot, you can track the revenues because now you've introduced a cashless system. So many of these interventions reduce the risk profile, improve the risk profile of these operators, indirectly then giving them access to better cost of capital. So we know from the bank's perspective that immediately improves the risk profile, and that will definitely give them a better pricing in the market. At this point in time, we're looking at this one pilot as our first loan application to see how do we test, how do we risk profile, how do we price this. Then once we have proof that this can be priced better, we can take it to the market and say, this is the reason why we believe the pricing should be improved for this, because we've dealt with the risks that banks normally are afraid to take.
Well, it's very interesting. What you want to say is one.
I'll quickly talk about the 2- and 3-wheelers. Just an example. And Addis is very, very unique in its case because the paratransit sector is a bit more regulated than other African cities. But what they asked is for all 2- and 3-wheelers to form a company. So they made it a requirement that if you wanted to get a license and you wanted to get subsidies and you wanted to be recognized and you wanted to benefit, that you would have to form and be part of these associations, and then there are benefits that you would get in this sense. So in a way, they incentivize the sort of formalization of some of these companies. But in Kenya and elsewhere, what we've seen is that there are companies that come from that, like Safe Boda is one, and many others, like the one that I showed in the picture, that have they're entering or trying to attract a market where they have trained drivers and they have these digital applications that really attract, considering all the challenges that we've seen. So they're using some of the gaps and the demands from the users, and by creating these companies and responding to these demands, actually being very profitable. So there are examples, and happy to share offline.
Okay. Thank you, Iman, and Amanda, Jackie, and Nanga. The discussion could be
something there.
Yes, Amanda.
I could add something over there onto what Iman has said. What we did in Kampala was identify the leadership structure that they already have, because we thought they were so disorganized, but actually they had stage leadership, they had division leadership, and district leadership. So we have succeeded in at least getting them define their leadership. Then we can pick it up from there and register them, zone them, and they become part of the transportation network in an organized way.
Okay, thank you. So I think, as we have said, and you have seen in the big screen, Tomorrow we will go more into depth of these discussions. I think we will have our 4 speakers present tomorrow, so you can continue exchanging with them. So I would like to conclude by thanking, well, and of course, Ivo will be around on all the teams of the SSATP. So thank you the World Bank and the World Resource Institute for giving us the opportunity to organize this event, and thank you all for participating.